On a crisp October evening in Manhattan, Charles and Allison Howard were the picture-perfect couple. Dressed in tailored designer suits, they were seated in the dimly lit dining room of their penthouse, high above the bustling streets. Their lives were gilded. Owners of a billion-dollar real estate empire, regulars at galas, and darlings of the tabloids. Tonight, however, their usually confident faces were drawn and tense. "Allison," Charles began, swirling his scotch, this, this can't be happening. We're losing everything. The New Jersey project fell through. The investors are pulling out. I've got lawsuits piling up on my desk." Allison, her fingers clenched around the stem of her wineglass, stared into the distance. "It's not just business, Charles. Ever since the twins were born, it's like a curse has fallen on us." At the mention of the twins, a heavy silence fell over the room. Born 8 months ago, Emily and Grace had captivated their parents at first with their rare, piercing blue eyes, a striking contrast to their parents' dark brown ones. But soon, the initial awe turned into fear as the Howards' empire began to crumble inexplicably. "Allison, don't say that," Charles said, though his voice lacked conviction. Allison slammed her glass on the table, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. "Then explain it, Charles. Everything was fine before they came. And those eyes? Everyone keeps commenting on how unnatural they look. I hear it in their voices. They're afraid." A deep sigh escaped Charles's lips. "We need answers," he said quietly. 2 days later, Charles and Allison found themselves in a small, incense-filled back room in Brooklyn. Sitting across from them was a middle-aged man with a piercing gaze and a head adorned with beaded jewelry. The shaman's room was a jarring contrast to the polished luxury the Howards were accustomed to. The man studied them for a long moment before speaking. "Your children," he said, his voice thick with an accent, "they carry a mark, a curse, if you will. Those blue eyes are not just rare, they are dangerous. They bring misfortune." Allison gasped, clutching Charles's arm. What can we do?" she whispered. The shaman leaned forward, his gaze heavy. "The only way to lift the curse is to separate yourselves from them, leave them behind and start anew." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Back in their penthouse that evening, Allison paced the marble floors while Charles nursed yet another drink. "We can't possibly," Charles began, but Allison cut him off. "Do you have a better idea? Because I'm fresh out of options, Charles." Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "Do you want to lose everything? Everything we've built? The house, the business, our reputation?" "And the girls?" Charles asked, his voice hollow. "What about them?" Allison's face hardened. "They'll be fine. Someone will find them. It's not like we're leaving them in the wilderness. It's New York City. People are kind, right?" Her laugh was sharp and bitter, the sound of a woman convincing herself of a lie. Late that night, under the cover of darkness, Charles and Allison drove to a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city. The streets were empty, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound. They placed the twins, bundled in a soft blanket, on the steps of an old brownstone. Beside them, Charles laid a note. "We can't care for them anymore. Please keep them safe." Allison's hands trembled as she kissed each baby on the forehead. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Charles pulled her away gently. They got back into the car, and as they drove off, Allison looked back, her vision blurred with tears. "They'll be okay, right?" she murmured. Charles didn't answer. He couldn't. In the rearview mirror, the bundled shapes of their daughters faded into the shadows, leaving the Howards to face the road ahead, and a future filled with the consequences of their choice. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Brooklyn, tugging at Ruth Mason's worn coat as she trudged home from her evening shift at Rosa's diner. Her hands clutched a paper bag containing leftover bread rolls. They were just going to throw them out anyway, Rosa had insisted. And a thermos of lukewarm coffee. At 62, Ruth had lived a life far from glamorous, but she had a wit sharp enough to slice through steel and a heart bigger than any paycheck. As she turned the corner to the quiet cul-de-sac where her small, creaky apartment stood, something unusual caught her eye. A bundle sat on the stoop of an old brownstone, half hidden in shadows. "Now, what on earth is that?" she muttered, stepping closer. "If it's another one of those TikTok pranks, I swear I'll..." Her words froze in her throat as she knelt and peeled back the blanket. Two tiny faces stared up at her, wide-eyed and shivering. Babies. 2 of them, twin girls with the most startling blue eyes she had ever seen. "Oh, sweet heavens," Ruth breathed, pressing her hand to her chest. "Where are your parents, little ones?" A folded note fell from the blanket, and Ruth's fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The message was short and cruel. "We can't care for them anymore. Please keep them safe." "Keep them safe?" Ruth scoffed, her Brooklyn accent thick with indignation. "What do they think I am, the Pope? I barely keep myself fed." One of the babies let out a small, plaintive cry, and Ruth's heart wrenched. "Oh, hush now, Sugarplum," she murmured, scooping them both up into her arms. "I didn't mean it. We'll figure something out. Ruth Mason's got plenty of love, even if the bank account's on life support." She glanced around the empty street, her sharp eyes searching for anyone who might claim these children. But the night was still, save for the wind rattling the street signs. Ruth sighed deeply. "Guess you're stuck with me, kiddos. Hope you like tuna casserole and reruns of Jeopardy!" Back at her tiny apartment, Ruth set the babies on the sagging couch and surveyed her cluttered living room. Fabric scraps and thread spools were scattered across every surface, remnants of her side hustle as a seamstress. The walls were lined with mismatched frames holding photos of a younger Ruth, her late husband, and the stray dogs they'd taken in over the years. "Well, it's no Ritz-Carlton, but it's home," she said, plopping down next to the girls. "You two need names, don't you? Can't just call you Baby 1 and Baby 2. Let's see." She studied their faces thoughtfully. The more serious-looking one, with furrowed brows even at this age, made a small grunt of disapproval. Ruth chuckled. "You've got opinions already, huh? Fine. You're Emily. And you." She turned to the other baby, whose tiny fists waved in the air as if conducting an invisible orchestra. "You're Grace. Emily and Grace Mason. Sounds good, doesn't it?" The babies didn't respond, of course, but Ruth nodded as if they'd agreed. "Perfect. Now let's find you something to eat." Feeding the twins proved to be a challenge. Ruth had no formula, and her fridge contained little more than a jar of pickles, half a loaf of bread, and a questionable carton of milk. She warmed the milk and prayed it wouldn't upset their tiny stomachs. "You're gonna have to work with me here, girls," she said as she tested the temperature on her wrist. "This ain't exactly Whole Foods." After what felt like an eternity of fussing and trial and error, both girls were finally fed and fast asleep in a makeshift crib Ruth had fashioned out of a laundry basket and a quilt. She sat back, exhausted but oddly content. "Well, Ruthie," she muttered to herself, "looks like you've gone from retired dog mom to full-time baby wrangler. Didn't see that one coming." The next morning, Ruth was up before dawn, as usual. She brewed a pot of coffee, her lifeline, and stood at the window watching the sun rise over the city. The twins stirred in their basket, their soft coos breaking the morning silence. Ruth turned to them, her hands on her hips. "All right, Emily and Grace, here's the deal. I've got a sewing job that's due tomorrow, and you're not exactly paying rent, so you'll have to keep yourselves entertained. Think you can manage?" Emily stared at her solemnly, while Grace blew a spit bubble. Ruth laughed, the sound warm and full. "Yeah, I didn't think so." Over the weeks, Ruth's neighbors began to notice the twins. Mrs. Delgado from 4B brought over a bag of hand-me-down baby clothes. "My grandson outgrew these ages ago," she said with a wave of her hand. Mr. Kapoor from the corner store started slipping Ruth jars of baby food with a conspiratorial wink. "For your little angels," he'd say. Even grumpy old Mr. Weinberg from upstairs, who rarely spoke to anyone, left a bag of diapers outside Ruth's door with a note. "Couldn't let you go broke buying these things." Ruth marveled at the kindness around her. "Looks like you two are bringing out the best in people," she told the twins one night. "Who knew a couple of blue-eyed munchkins could turn this building into a Hallmark movie?" As months passed, Ruth and the twins settled into a routine. She sang to them while she sewed, told them stories about her late husband, and introduced them to the joys of old game shows. "You've got to start young if you want to master the art of trivia," she said as they watched Alex Trebek. But deep down, Ruth knew this wasn't a permanent solution. She had no savings, no retirement plan, and now 2 little lives depending on her. Still, every time she looked into their bright, trusting eyes, she felt a surge of determination. "We'll make it work," she promised them one night, tucking them into their laundry basket crib. "We're a team now, and Ruth Mason doesn't quit. Not for anything." As she sat back with her cup of tea, listening to the gentle rhythm of their breathing, Ruth realized that her life, though chaotic and uncertain, had never felt so full. By the time Emily and Grace were 8 years old, Ruth's small Brooklyn apartment had become a hub of creativity and curiosity. The twins' personalities were blossoming in ways as distinct as the colors of the quilts Ruth sewed late into the night. Emily, with her ever serious expression, was rarely seen without a book. Her fascination with how things worked led her to dismantle a broken clock Ruth had bought at a thrift store. "I just want to see how the gears fit together," she explained when Ruth found her surrounded by tiny metal parts. Grace, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of color and imagination. She covered every scrap of paper she could find with doodles and sketches. "Ruthie, look," she would exclaim, holding up her latest masterpiece. "It's you as a queen." Ruth laughed, pointing at the exaggerated crown on her head. "Sweetheart, the only royal thing about me is the hole in my sock." One morning, Ruth watched from the kitchen as the twins worked on a school project at the cluttered dining table. Emily scribbled equations onto a sheet of paper, while Grace drew a colorful chart to accompany them. The theme was weather patterns, and the girls were combining their talents to predict rainfall in their neighborhood. "Emily," Grace said, tilting her head, "how do you even know where the rain will go? Do you have a magic brain?" Emily frowned. "It's just math. The patterns tell you everything if you look closely enough." Ruth leaned over, placing a plate of toast in front of them. "You two are like peanut butter and jelly, different but perfect together." At school, however, things weren't so harmonious. The twins' blue eyes still drew attention, and not all of it was kind. Kids whispered behind their backs and occasionally made cruel comments. "Aliens from Mars," one boy muttered when Emily walked past. During lunch one day, Grace overheard a group of kids mocking them. "They're so weird. Who has eyes like that?" one sneered. Grace slammed her lunch tray down at their table. "Weird? At least we don't think fart jokes are funny. Grow up." The cafeteria fell silent as Grace stormed off, leaving the group speechless. Emily caught up with her in the hallway. "Grace, you didn't have to do that." Grace shrugged. "Someone had to say it. Besides, we've got better things to do than worry about them." That evening, Ruth found the twins unusually quiet. They sat on the couch, huddled under one of her quilts. She sat down beside them. "All right, out with it. What's got my girls looking like someone stole their dessert?" Emily hesitated, then spoke. "Why do people hate us, Ruthie? Is it because we're different?" Ruth pulled them close. "Listen to me, my loves. People are scared of what they don't understand. But being different, that's your superpower. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small because of it." Grace smirked, breaking the tension. "So, like, we're superheroes?" "Exactly," Ruth said, ruffling her hair. "Now go put on your pajamas, super twins. Tomorrow's another day to save the world, or at least ace your math test." Thus, Emily and Grace began to see their differences not as burdens, but as gifts. While the world outside often felt unkind, their home was a sanctuary filled with love, laughter, and the quiet determination of two girls who were destined for greatness. Emily and Grace's fascination with the world around them only deepened as they grew. Emily's knack for spotting patterns became more than a hobby. It turned into something extraordinary. One afternoon, as she sat cross-legged on the floor with a notebook, she called out to Grace. "Come look at this," Emily said, her voice filled with excitement. "The numbers aren't just random, they mean something." Grace wandered over, her hands smudged with paint from her latest creation. "What numbers? Let me guess. More boring math stuff?" Emily rolled her eyes but smiled. "It's not boring. Watch." She pointed to a series of scribbled equations and diagrams. "I think I can predict the exact time it'll start raining tomorrow." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me you're a weather wizard now?" Emily laughed. "It's not magic. It's logic. The patterns in the data, they all add up." The next day, Emily's prediction came true. At precisely 3:17 p.m., rain began to fall over their neighborhood. Grace stood at the window, watching droplets trickle down the glass. "Okay, I admit it. That was pretty cool," Grace said, turning to her sister. "But if you're going to be a weather genius, we need to make it fun." Emily frowned. "How?" Grace held up her sketchbook. "With this." Over the next few weeks, the twins worked together, combining Emily's calculations with Grace's artistic flair. Grace created vibrant, animated visuals to accompany Emily's predictions. Their little weather project turned into something remarkable, a prototype that amazed even their teachers. One rainy afternoon, as they presented their project in class, their teacher's jaw dropped. "Emily, Grace," she said, this is incredible. How did you do it?" Emily explained the math, while Grace proudly showed off her illustrations. Their classmates, who usually ignored them, watched in awe. "Looks like the alien twins just became geniuses," one boy muttered, grudgingly impressed. Grace turned to Emily and whispered, "Told you we're superheroes." Back at home, Ruth was their biggest cheerleader. "You two are unstoppable," she said as they excitedly shared their success. "Next thing I know, you'll be predicting stock markets and solving world hunger." Grace grinned. "One step at a time, Ruthie. Right now, we're just trying to figure out what's for dinner." Ruth threw up her hands in mock frustration. "How about you predict what happens if you don't set the table?" The twins' discovery marked a turning point. Their small project grew into something bigger, a glimpse of the incredible potential they possessed. With Ruth's unwavering support and each other's strengths, Emily and Grace began to dream of how their talents could change the world. Little did they know, their journey was only just beginning. By the time Emily and Grace turned 10, Ruth realized it was time to broaden their horizons. Though her tiny apartment had become a nurturing haven, Ruth worried the girls were missing out on the larger world. "All right, you two," she declared one morning over breakfast. "It's time for an adventure." Grace, her mouth full of cereal, perked up. "Are we going to space? Because I already have a name for our rocket, the Blue Streak." Emily set down her book and looked skeptical. "Please tell me this isn't another walk to the park, Ruthie." Ruth chuckled, patting Emily's head. "Not this time. We're heading downtown. There's a library with your name on it, Emily, and an art exhibit for you, Grace." When they arrived at the Brooklyn Public Library, Emily's eyes widened. The vast rows of bookshelves seemed endless, a treasure trove waiting to be explored. "Stay close, all right?" Ruth called after her. But Emily was already gone, darting toward the science section like a moth to a flame. Grace lingered by the entrance, less impressed. "This place smells funny," she muttered. Ruth handed her a sketchbook and smiled. "Then draw something beautiful to balance it out." While Emily immersed herself in books about physics and meteorology, Grace wandered the library, observing people and sketching them in her notebook. A young woman reading to her toddler caught Grace's attention. She began to draw, capturing the soft bond between the pair. When Ruth returned, she found Emily hunched over a pile of books and Grace proudly showing her sketch to a nearby librarian. "Your girls are so talented," the librarian said with a warm smile. "They get it from me," Ruth joked. "I'm just hiding my genius under this hat." The second stop was an art exhibit featuring local artists. Grace's excitement bubbled over as they walked through the gallery. She paused in front of a mural depicting the Brooklyn skyline at sunset, her fingers itching to draw something just as grand. "This," Grace whispered to Ruth, "this is what I want to do. Make people feel like this." Ruth squeezed her hand. "Then you will, honey. Just keep putting your heart into it." As the day wound down, they stopped at a small cafe for sandwiches. Ruth couldn't help but marvel at how much the girls had grown. "You two are like a pair of shooting stars," she said, stirring her tea. "Bright, brilliant, and impossible to ignore." Grace grinned. "And just as fast." Emily smirked. "Unless we burn out first." "Not on my watch," Ruth replied, her voice firm but filled with love. "I'll make sure you both keep shining." For Emily and Grace, the day was a glimpse of what lay beyond their apartment walls, a world brimming with challenges, inspiration, and endless possibilities. As much as the day at the library and art exhibit had inspired Emily and Grace, it also exposed them to a harsh reality. The outside world wasn't always kind. While the twins thrived in the safety of Ruth's home, stepping beyond it meant facing judgments and whispers about their unusual blue eyes. The first incident happened at the cafe. As Ruth paid for their meal, an older woman seated nearby stared at the twins with an expression that could only be described as suspicious. "Are they adopted?" the woman finally asked, her tone sharp. "I've never seen eyes like that." Ruth turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Why, yes," she said with a smile so sweet it could melt butter. "Straight from the heavens. They're angels, didn't you know?" Emily lowered her head, avoiding the woman's gaze, while Grace glared. "Ruthie, Grace whispered fiercely. Why didn't you say she's rude? Ruth leaned down, whispering back, because some folks don't deserve the truth, sugar. On the way home, the tension lingered. Emily stared out the bus window, lost in thought. Ruthie, she said quietly, why do people always look at us like that? Ruth sighed, pulling the twins closer. Because you're special, baby. And special scares some people. But let me tell you something. Fear and envy don't stand a chance against kindness and confidence. Grace, ever defiant, added, or a really good comeback. Ruth chuckled. That too. But don't waste your breath on people who don't matter. Back in their neighborhood, the girls felt the comfort of familiar streets and faces. Mr. Kapoor, the corner shop owner, waved as they passed by. Ah, my favorite twins. Did you conquer the city today? Grace grinned. We conquered books and paintings. Good, he replied. Books and paintings are much better than city nonsense. As they climbed the stairs to their apartment, Ruth noticed Emily's lingering silence. Once inside, she set her purse down and sat beside her on the couch. All right, out with it. What's rattling around in that big brain of yours? Emily hesitated before speaking. It's just, I know I shouldn't care what people think, but I do. They look at us like we don't belong. Ruth nodded, her face serious. I won't lie to you, Emily. People can be cruel, especially when they don't understand something. But listen to me, belonging doesn't come from their opinions. It comes from knowing who you are and being proud of it. Grace plopped down beside them, holding her sketchbook. And for the record, she added, if we don't belong, that just means we're too cool for them. Emily cracked a small smile. Maybe. No maybe about it, Ruth said firmly. You're both one of a kind, and the world is lucky to have you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. That night, as the twins settled into bed, Ruth tucked them in with extra care. You two have more strength and smarts than most grown-ups, she said softly. But even the strongest people need a reminder sometimes. You don't have to fit in to make a difference. You just have to be you. Emily and Grace drifted off to sleep, their hearts a little lighter. Ruth watched them for a moment, her expression a mix of pride and fierce determination. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she also knew her girls were destined for greatness, no matter what the world thought.